All right. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's edition of The Law and You. I'm your host, yours truly, attorney at law, Shellon Washington. It is my pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm excited to be here. I hope you guys are having a great weekend. It's a little bit rainy where I'm at. It's a little bit gloomy outside. I guess we're having a little bit of the effects of the weather from the hurricane, but it's otherwise okay. It's a great weekend. It's a great Saturday afternoon for those of you who celebrate the Sabbath. Happy Sabbath. And great, it's an honor to be here today to bring you again another edition of The Law and You. Today we'll be discussing post nuptials and whether or not a post nuptial is a great idea for you. In most of my previous videos, I've discussed, grounds for divorce, annulment, and some of the reasons why people end up in divorce. And I've also discussed prenuptials. So a post-nuptial can be used if you did not secure yourself with a prenuptial. And we want to talk a little bit about when is a post-nuptial. When should you use it and when should you not use a post-nuptial? So a lot of times people get married where there's an inequality of finance. So a lot of times it's not equal, it's not balanced. We often find either a man, he marries a woman who does not have the capability of financing herself or being able to support herself financially. She's financially weak. Or we find vice versa. We find a situation where a man is financially weak and a woman is financially strong. And in either instance, the spouse who's not financially strong end up becoming a liability on the spouse who is financially secure and financially strong. And the spouse who's financially strong ends up pulling the weight of the family. And in certain states, you go where one spouse is pulling the weight of the family and the equities are not balanced at all. And then you go to the court, depending on which state you're in. If you're in the state of New York or New Jersey, fortunately for you, you can balance the equities in your favor and walk away still standing strong. But it doesn't take from the fact that you might end up having to support a spouse who's a financial liability. One of the things with the state, which no one will tell you, is the state does not want a liability. Whichever state you're living in, that state does not want a liability, a burden. And the judges, whether you think of it this way or not, judges work for the state. They're actually working for the state. We often see them as working for us, but the realities are they're not really working for us. They're working for the state. And the state does not want you to become a financial liability or a responsibility that they'll have to provide you with social services, social security, food stamp, welfare benefits. They do not want that typically. So if you're in a situation where you have a spouse who's considered a money spouse, the state want to ensure that that spouse bears that burden of taking care of you financially, and that the state is not saddled with that responsibility of taking care of you. And there are several instances, I've talked about this numerous times before in previous videos, where Caribbean spouse, Caribbean husband, Caribbean wife, they go to their home country, they marry these people, they bring them back to the United States, and they somehow doesn't understand that if you're going to do that, that person is going to become a financial responsibility to you. I've seen instances where a person brought up a spouse who was not working, didn't have no formal education, and wasn't even capable at any point of getting themselves financially stable because of the age. The woman is almost 40 years old by the time the husband brought the woman up. She couldn't read and write properly. She couldn't do anything really, but it was his choice to bring a person of that level to the United States. And then once the marriage doesn't work out, the court was like, you've got to bear the burden of taking care of this spouse. Fortunately, marriages that are very short in duration, there's not much you can get out of it. a very short marriage. And this is something people doesn't understand. They think, okay, the marriage is short, I'm entitled to this, I'm entitled to that, I'm entitled. But no, you're not. It's a very short marriage. So you're not going to get, you're going to walk away with nothing much. And if you do get support, it's going to be a limited duration support, which is going to be half in New Jersey, half of the length of the marriage. And in New York, it could be a year, less than a year, or whatever the court determines is appropriate, but it's definitely not going to be non-durational divorce. So in those instances where you go to marry a spouse in a foreign country to bring them to the United States, my advice to you, if you fail to get a prenuptial before you marry that person, because there are many instances where people fail to get a prenuptial, and a prenuptial is just an agreement between you and your spouse prior to the marriage, whereby you declare and the spouse, the person declares prior to the marriage that, hey, if we decide to terminate this marriage at some point, neither of us are going to be responsible for supporting the other party. And that is a prenuptial, where you make sure you enter into an agreement prior to entering into the marriage, where you say, well, we're not going to support each other. And then even if we decide that even if we decide, okay, we're gonna acquire assets together, this is the way the assets is gonna split. Any asset that we acquire jointly, we're gonna get what we put in. Each of us are gonna get out what we put in. And then that's a very easy way to deal with it prior to getting married. You protect the assets. You said anything that you've purchased prior to the marriage is not going to be deemed marital asset. It's going to be separate, and we're not going to be sharing this as marital asset. And any asset that we acquire during the marriage, we're going to divide that asset based on what you have personally put in. And that's honestly the way it should always be. Nobody should get anything more than what they put into something. So if you put nothing in, you should get nothing out. But unfortunately, the way the law tries to balance the equities is to determine, well, in a sense, they do determine what you put in, because in a sense, they try to weigh the equities. For instance, if somebody's a housewife, they weigh the value of what the housewife would have been putting in or contributing to the home, which would have been her time or labor to take care of the children, to cook food, to clean the house, to make sure that the household was run smoothly. And that is considered a form of work. So some people think, oh, being a housewife is not working, but the law sees it very much as a form of working. So back to the post-nuptial. When is the post-nuptial right for you? When should you actually get a post-nuptial? Just before I get into that, just let me make it very clear. A post-nuptial is difficult to get, but it's doable. If both parties are on the same page and they're agreeable with each other, you can still get a post-nuptial. And a post-nuptial is most likely to be done in a situation where you have a husband and a wife, and they're both financially strong, and they're both not in a fighting mode. They don't want to fight each other. They're not greedy for what each other acquired during the marriage, and they're willing to resolve their problems outside of a court. Now, you tell people that outside of the court is the best possible way to resolve your problems, and some people don't get it. They're completely asleep. They rather take their lives and put it into the hands of a judge. And just so y'all know, that judges has the same type of biases and prejudice like anybody else. So when you take your life and put it into one person's hand, you're exposing yourself to whatever that person decides for you. Versus if you sit down with your spouse and you discuss what you guys are going to do with your assets, if you decide to go your separate ways, that would be much, much better for you. And this is where the post-nuptial comes in. The post-nuptial is much more appropriate in instances where there's a husband and wife. They're okay with each other's, but sometimes they get ups and downs. There's problems every now and then. And they decide, like, listen, let's sit down together. Let's reason this out. And let's put together an agreement so that if we decide 10 years down the road that we're going to separate, this is how our separation is going to be. Now, on the post-nuptial is how the persons decide, how the husband and wife And a post-nuptial is only done after the nuptials, after the marriage. So that's where the husband and wife, they sit down together and they determine how they're going to split their assets in the event the parties decide to be divorced. Now, I've seen instances where one party is an investor and one party just likes to own a pension or retirement account. I've seen this in several instances. Now, where one party wants a pension and the other party wants to just own retirement accounts, and they don't want to invest in real property, but you have one spouse investing in real property or whatever other type of assets. In that case, the most appropriate thing would be for them to do is to sit down and say, well, whoever have the retirement account, maybe you can keep your retirement accounts on the separation, and the person who has the investments like property, stocks, bonds, whatever, you keep that. Or alternatively, they can determine, okay, let's split everything down the middle. You give me half of whatever you get and half of whatever I have. And the half is more appropriate when the parties meet each other halfway on everything. There are instances where people are married and one person is pulling the weight. And most of the situation where one person is pulling the weight is where the husband is the financially strong person. But they're exception to the rule. There are some men who likes to be carried by a woman. There are instances where some men are incredibly lazy. They would sit, and I've seen this so many times. Clients would come in and they would complain about the husband being very lazy and the woman is working very hard to support the family. And it's disheartening because men are generally sought out as hunters, as providers, as the one who takes care of the household. But very often we see in our community where the wife is the person who brings in the income. She takes care of the family. And in that situation, there is an inequality because one spouse is carrying the other spouse. And in that situation, it's most appropriate to give the spouse who's carrying the burden, pulling the household weight. It's most appropriate to give that spouse most of everything so that that spouse will continue to be financially strong even after the separation. It's not a good look for a spouse who is economically weak and lazy and doesn't want to go out there and earn a living and pull their own part of the bargain to share equally with the spouse who has done most of the work. And to tell you the truth, guys, if you want to avoid a situation where you have a lazy husband or wife trying to share equally with you or trying to claim, because most of the time they don't prevail. The lazy spouse, mostly the man, because this country does not play with men. Men have the onus of providing. And a lot of times the court see a man who is trying to take what he didn't reap where he didn't sow, as a parasite, as lazy, as wanting to reap somewhere where he didn't sow, and especially if his income is, reasonable, but he never really provided for his family, never really contributed for his family. That's a parasite. That's a parasitic behavior that the courts usually frowned upon, and they reject those people. Those people are dealt harshly by judges because you are a provider. And if you're in a household, you're expected as a man to come equally with your wife. And in the same case with a woman, if a woman is just, but the women are usually treated differently. If a woman is a parasite and she's just lazy and she's lying at home, not working, not contributing to the household, not cooking, not cleaning, not taking care of children, those are things that can be raised in an argument in court. But most of the time, the woman is going to end up getting spousal support, because what does the court look at? The status quo, the lifestyle that the husband afforded the wife during the marriage. But vice versa, it doesn't go that way, where the man is working, he has the capabilities of being financially dependent. The court will not encourage him to be a parasite. He will be dealt with. He will be dealt with by the court, especially those who don't pay their child support. They play around with it. I know instances where you have a man working for $150,000 and he's getting $150,000. Let's say in some cases he's getting almost $100,000 in W-2 income. And then, he's working somewhere else and getting another $20,000. And then, they might have VA benefits for people who are veteran. I know people who gets $150,000 a year and try to pay $1,000 in child support. Outrageous, egregious. People like that, the court deals with them viciously because the court does not want the state to take care of those children. The court does not want those children to become a liability on the state way in which the parties live. So the husband or the father of the children must take on his responsibility. Now, back to my prenuptial. The reason why you should get the prenuptial, where the equities are balanced and both spouses are working for about the same amount of money and they're equally contributing towards the expenses in the home, you need to work that out, because you don't want to go to court now and battle and pay thousands of dollars in legal fees just to sort something out that you could have done with your wife at home. Because obviously, if you're equal, both of you are putting the equal amount of money towards the household expenses, then it just so happened that you should both be able to get half of everything. On the other hand, where one spouse is doing the most, one spouse is paying for everything, one spouse is pulling the weight of the household, then the spouse who's not pulling their weight, they deserve to get whatever they put in. So if you put nothing in, you get nothing out. Because what is the cost for a rent versus the cost of a mortgage? You know, if a person is contributing what it would cost for them to live on their own, then you're not entitled to anything, because the cost of living for you to live on your own versus combining your resources and living together as a household is obviously different. So if I would pay right now $3,500 to live on my own as a single person with no children, right? And I have a household with 2 children and a husband, it probably going to send my costs up, because number one, we're going to need a bigger square footage of space to live in. Number two, the groceries, the household expenses, everything else would go up. So if it costs me $3,500 to live on my own, to live in a household with a family is probably going to cost me $5,000 a month. And then the other partner is going to pay another five. So we're going to have a combined expenses of $10,000 a month. And if I've been going halfway all the time on everything, then yes, the law is going to say, yes, you're entitled to 50% of everything because you've been going 50% with your spouse. But if somebody is crazy enough to litigate that and lose thousands of dollars on legal fees, I would say neither of the parties has no brain. And in that case, a prenuptial, a postnuptial would have been appropriate. That in a postnuptial, both parties would sit together and determine, okay, if they have pension, if they have 401k, they would list all of their assets and then determine if they're going to do a set off. A set off is where both parties has equal amount of assets. So you say, okay, you keep what you have and I keep what I have because we have actually the same types of assets. But if it's a case where they have a joint property together, then one party could determine, okay, if we do separate, I'm going to give you $50,000 for the value of your share, or 50% of the equity in the property if we do separate, because we were both going 50% on all of the expenses in the household. But if it's a case where one party, the money spouse, there's a money spouse, and then there's a spouse that doesn't have anything, and you guys want to do a prenuptial, then the money spouse and the spouse without could sit and decide, okay, if we decide to terminate this relationship, here's what's going to happen. I've been putting the most, so I think I am deserving of 70%. You've been putting only 30%. You're deserving of 30% of the value of everything that I have. And if we do it that way, then I can decide I'm going to pay you for at least 1 year spousal support or something for at least 1 year to offset it. So the parties could sit and determine that way, because if they go to court and the marriage wasn't a lengthy marriage, the non-money spouse could walk away with no support or virtually nothing. So it's best if the parties sit together, let common sense prevail. I'm telling you guys, let common sense prevail, because I've seen instances in court where I tell the parties, let's try to settle this matter. One party is refusing, and then you go before the court, and then the party who was refusing to settle ends up in jeopardy, because then they piss the court off. The court likes to see people trying to work out their own problems. A lot of times the judges does not want to sit and hear your dirty story and determine your life for you. But a lot of times people in their ignorance put their lives into the judge's hands for the judge to make a decision on something so simple that you could have determined on your own, especially if it's not a state with where the parties have like $10 million in assets, or $20 million in assets, or $20 billion in assets, because those huge estate, sometimes it takes time to determine how the estate is going to be divided, especially where the equities are not balanced. And as you guys know, most of the time the equities are not balanced, because mostly you're going to find either a man is working for a whole lot of money and the woman is staying home, or the man is working for a whole lot of money and the woman is working for minimum wages or something ridiculous, because he prefer her to work and put something into the household versus putting nothing at all. I've seen instances where a Guyanese man, he was pulling the weight of his entire household, and his wife wasn't working for much. She was working for maybe 20 something $1,000 a year, and he kept pulling the weight of the household. And I told him, if you're gonna do this, just know that when it comes to time for the divorce, what's going to happen is the court's going to ask you to pay spousal support to that person. So the prenuptial, the postnuptial would protect anybody in a situation like that, in terms of what you're going to pay out if the marriage and if it doesn't last. And these are things that we all have to prepare for in life, because not at all times your marriage works out the way you want it to. Not at all times things are lasting. As we know, more than 50% of marriages in the United States end in divorce. In certain other countries, the rate is not that high, because a lot of times people are committed, for better, for worse. And I know, especially Guyanese people, the men will be cheating. They'll be running around, but for better, for worse, and they will stay there and cheat on their wives. And the wives a lot of time ignore, because the man is the provider. For years, the men has always been mostly the provider in the household, in Caribbean household especially. And the wife has been the caretaker. She would stay home, take care of the children, ensure the meals are prepared, the house is maintained in an orderly fashion. So we from the Caribbean people know that that's traditionally how this go. But in Guyana and certain other country, the way the law protects the non-money spouse doesn't really happen that way in Guyana. There's not much protection. There's child support, of course. You could always get some support, but it doesn't protect the spouse the way you're protected in the United States. The United States try to make sure that nobody's going to become a ward on the state, so that the state is not the one, providing you with food stamps, medical, and everything else that you might need. Housing also, I've had situations where, both spouses were non-money spouses, and that's really bad. Where you have a case where both spouses are non-money spouses, means that neither of them could support the other. So the other spouse had to end up becoming a ward of the state anyway, because the husband was unable, or incapable, I should say, of providing spousal support for his wife, as he was barely getting by on a minimum wage job, and the wife was incapable of obtaining employment because of her educational status and disability and whatever else she was affected by. She couldn't have. But guys, the post-nuptial is really important. If you know that you're on speaking terms with your spouse, but you know that there's trouble brewing in the air, I would say make sure you ask them, hey, could you sign this post-nuptial? Or, better yet, if you married a person in a third world, not third world, but in a developing country from the Caribbean, and you want to bring them to the United States, what you could do is you can tell them, like, hey, I'm not going to file for you unless you sign a post-nuptial. Because let me tell you guys, you got to be careful. A lot of times people come from the Caribbean and they switch up on you. They change. They become Americanized, we call it, because, in Guyana, in the Caribbean, there's hardly any protection for spouses, right? But when people come to America and they realize that, hey, this person is not treating me right, I would like to leave this relationship. They realize quickly that if they leave the relationship, they're going to be protected under the law. The law is going to make the spouse who they claim to be abusive support them, or the spouse could be evicted from their own home. One of the most weaponized tools that women use against men in America is an order of protection. A lot of times they go and fabricate things to the court just to get an order of protection to get the spouse out of the marital home. I've seen this happen so many times. So, you have to be careful. So if you're going to go back to Ghana, back to Trinidad, Jamaica, wherever you're from, and marry a spouse, tell the person, if you didn't know this, what I'm telling you today, when you go back and you see the spouse, you already married, tell them, listen, I'm filing for you. I'm in the process of bringing you to the United States, but here's what I would like for you to do. Can you sign this post nuptial? And in the post nuptial, it's gonna tell the spouse that even if they come here, they become a millionaire, whatever it is, neither of you going to be responsible for supporting the other in the event of a divorce, but you're going to only split the assets that you acquired jointly 50-50, and the assets that you had in the United States prior to that spouse coming here is protected, and it will never be considered marital assets. Even if during the marriage you were both working and paying that mortgage, you have to specify that asset will never become marital asset in that agreement. In that way, you're protecting yourself, you're protecting your pre-acquired assets, because as you know, pre-acquired assets, that's assets you acquired prior to marriage, can become marital assets if you're taking marital funds and putting into that asset. So for instance, if you purchase a home before you marry and bring your spouse up to the United States, and the spouse comes, get a job, and you're both working and paying the mortgage, then that property becomes marital assets because you're using marital assets to pay the mortgage. But you can stop that from happening by specifying under a post-nuptial that regardless of what happened, regardless of how the mortgage is paid, that property will never become a marital asset. You could easily have the spouse go into the U.S. Embassy and have the document notarized, and you sign your portion in the United States and have it notarized. That way it's sealed, it's concrete, it's protected, it's legitimate. And you could even advise your spouse in whatever country that they're in to go see a lawyer, consult with a lawyer about the terms of it, so that once they sign it, you know that they can't come and say, oh, it was fraud, I was forced into signing it, it's not legal. You know that it will be legal and binding because it was signed and notarized before a notary public. So your spouse cannot ever back out on it. I encourage you guys, if you're going to go anywhere and marry someone and bring them here, if you're already married, do a post-nuptial with that person prior to filing to bring them to the United States. And if you're not married yet, make sure you look at my videos on prenuptials. Get a prenuptial to protect yourself. The worst could happen is the spouse end up being a millionaire, and you're not going to get much of what they have, but you'll get half of any asset you acquired together. Guys, the time is up. Thank you so much for joining me today on today's edition of The Law and You. I'll be back here again next week at the same time at 4 p.m. to bring you again live The Law and You. Thank you so much. I want you to continue to press the like button and continue to share the live. Every time I come here, I encourage you guys to share the live so we can get more and more audience. We can reach more and more people who would like to know the content that I've been creating here from week after week. Thank you so much, guys. And I do hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll see you again next Saturday. And if you need legal consultation, legal advice, my number is right on the screen. Give me a call, 718-877-3100. These videos are brought to you by my law firm, the Washington Law Firm, located at 455 Utica Avenue in Brooklyn, New York. Thank you, guys.